Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening, Frank.
Good evening, Father Silly. Good evening.
Father.
Well, we've got most people present here. I don't see. Do we have our Filipino in the Deacon Albans in America, is he not, or is he Filipino in Philippines? No, you're in Philippines, I think. Do we have how many of our how Filipinos do we have today?
Two. Two. I'm with,
Okay.
I'm with Deacon Rex now.
Okay. Very good. Um, a little bit of housekeeping. I spoke with the administrators on Monday and I asked for administrative rights to the website so I could upload the slides as well as the recordings. Do not have that yet. As soon as I do, I will upload the slides by themselves so you don't have to watch the whole thing and you can just look at the slides. Um, and as I will do that as soon as I can. Once we finish this evening, probably tomorrow morning, I will upload out this recording to the YouTube so you can look that over again. But I want to make sure this is as accessible as possible. Also, someone mentioned kind of greatest hits. I figure if you can jump to the slides, you can take a look at what we're talking. If anybody has any, wants any, remembers hearing something that I don't cover directly, or wants any more information on any of the subjects in any of the centuries, I can go into that. Um, I'm want to look into doing a little bit of reading, which I will look into a little bit later on. Right now, we're moving on the centuries here, but I do want to supplement with a little bit of reading. But I'm I'm trying to decide what at this point in time. None of it will be on any kind of an exam. It'll be a matter of to better appreciate and understand the century we're covering, and any of the actors or players therein. All right, we're just about, what time are we here? We're at 6:03. All right. Um, I'm seeing all the usual suspects. Should we have the two Filipinos, so I think we could probably look into getting going here. All right. We are beginning with the 700s this time, which has several sub things. I think we can still get through this and next century in our 2 hour window, but we'll see what we can do here. All right. So last time we saw the birth of Islam, we're going to see now what does the spread of Islam look like and how does it affect the world? Looking at the birth of Christendom as its own sort of thing, and in England, the idea of King Arthur, which is a fascinating little footnote. The Vikings begin to make their first forays and dynastic struggles. So, the spread of Islam. Actually, before I begin, I'm sorry, we should begin with prayer before I do that. I was getting all excited here. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Watch over us, O Lord, as we study the history of thy church, and grant us wisdom and understanding unto what thou hast done in the mysteries of the aspects of history, and help us to better understand and appreciate your hand in all these things. In the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.
Amen.
All right, onward and upward. So Islam was born in the 600s, but its spread was prodigious. And throughout the following century, is the world saw Islam take all northern Africa, Spain, really, and the western part of Asia as well. The territory was already weak due to the failing and ailing Roman administration, so Islam was able to take territory quickly and with little resistance. Islam was able to take the lands of the Eastern Roman Empire with very little trouble and settle them. The physical spread of Islam. Is that the next one? Yes, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
The physical spread of Islam was incredible. As I say, they went in through areas that were not very well organized, and they went in lightning fast, and they set up and were able to settle these areas very quickly. Again, when they would go into an area that was either convert or die, which meant many people ended up becoming Islamic in order to stay alive. Um, and so the success was quite substantial. Again, very little resistance. And as they came in, they organized themselves so that the powers that were there already found themselves befuddled, while Islam seemed to be very well organized. Islam brought with it several things that made it unique. One was a sort of architecture. It went into the Greek world, it took the Greek world, and it borrowed its ideas and built on it. And whether it was Western Asia, around the Holy Land, in Arabia itself, or North Africa, each of them had their own unique style of architecture, which was ornate and indefinitely Islamic. You can see the style here of the formation of the buildings, the arches, and the decorations, which was uniquely Islamic. The even some of the symmetry there almost has, but you can see it borrowed. You can see it borrowed from Rome, and you can see it borrowed from Greece. But there's a very specific style that was very evocative about it. Its decorations, often having writings on the outside of the building and having symbols on it. The idea of the dome, which was refined from what the Greeks had done in Constantinople, very unique and specific style of there. Um, the use of materials of marble and the like, the way they were tailored, the way they were structured, took a great deal of interest in the architecture that they built and how they built it. Um, Again, the style, very consistent in their style, very consistent with individual flavors for various areas, still a very consistent way of doing things, very evocative of Islam interiorly and exteriorly. The interior decoration was ornate, was very oriental, had a real feeling, did not have a Western feeling really at all. It was very unique, very oriental, and definitely had this feeling of the kind of the desert Muslim world that it came from. Between the Holy Land and Africa, again, you can see style, the writing, all right, the structure, the way of the buildings, the geometric octagons and pentagons and things like this that were uniquely Islamic. And again, the interior decoration, very heavily pattern oriented. Not a lot of, or if any, terrestrial images. Sometimes floral, but often very geometric and very pattern oriented. North Africa, again, you can see the design very well to fit into a very hot environment and remain cool and still has a definite feel and a style to it. Same idea, very North Africa again, but you can see, look at it right away, the domes and the structures and the arches, very typical, the pattern is very Islamic. The arrival of Islam, and especially North Africa, brought with it a sort of renaissance of education and commerce. The Roman educational and commercial structures were in serious decay, and the arriving or invading armies of the Goths and Vandals and others did nothing to stabilize things. Islam, because it was centrally run, very culturally cohesive, and brought prosperity in the areas it conquered, it took what the Greeks had built and gave it its own flourish. Um, Culturally, Islam was very cohesive. As you can see from the architectural structure there, if you could tell it right away, once you learned it, you knew it, and you could take what you knew and go anywhere from by the hundreds, from Spain, North Africa, all the way into Asia. Commerce and trade and architecture flourished. The ability to learn something, to learn the Arabic language, to learn the commerce and trade, to learn architecture and such allowed you to travel the entire length of the Muslim world and apply your trade. So the ability opened up and created a sort of cultural empire in a sense. The Muslims created and allowed people to carry goods and services all through this Muslim world and to trade, to buy and sell, and the like. Coinage was standardized in much of the empire, so you could take your coins and take them anywhere you wanted to. Again, in lower parts of Spain, all through North Africa, up into Arabia, and up into the Levant, Iraq, and Iran area, the size of that massive there. So you could take and you could travel along and spend your coinage, which was not the case in Europe right now with its fractured kingdoms. You also had the introduction of commercial mathematics. The Islamic world took a lot from the Greek world and brought in this idea, and commerce and trade were very, very big. Islam shares that with the Jews in many senses, this idea of commerce and trade and such. And the creation of the abacus as a means of computing and counting out monies and things like that. The abacus is a fascinating piece of early equipment for counting. If you're not familiar, it starts at the bottom and the ones, the tens, the hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. So you'd count out when each of them has 10, you'd count out 10. When you got 10 at the bottom, you'd slide one beat over. You'd count out another 10, slide another beat over, and you'd continue on your way up. So you could read this here as 34,523. Um, and and if you can actually count out and look at your figures right there, and this was used all through the Muslim world for the trade and mathematics and doing of commerce. The introduction of Roman numer or the pardon yeah, of Arabic numerals versus Roman numerals. Um, the Roman numerals required adding. You can see the Roman numerals 3, you go to 4, it's 5 minus 1, and then 5, 5 plus 1, 5 plus 2, 5 plus 3 required the addition in your own head. Whereas the Arabic numerals did not. It was again, it's set up the same way the abacus is. The first line is the ones line. You go all the way down at 10, you add a 0, which was also brought in by the Arabs. You add a 0 now, and you have one in the tens column. So one in the one in the tens. That continues up to 100, one in the 100 column, one of the ones, one in the tens, and one in the hundreds. And you can see how, same way the abacus works, that the numerical system followed along the way these Arabic numerals did, and was much more efficient system and easier to follow along than that of the Roman system. You had the introduction of the zero and the introduction partially of algebra. Now, algebra was not mastered or anything under the Arabs. However, this idea of architectural mathematics and again commercial mathematics became very was very widespread in this, and the idea of adding the introduction of a letter figuring for X kind of thing began to come in with the introduction of Arabic with Arabic mathematics. Geography and geometry. The Greeks, again, the Arabs took what they had in Greek and translated it into Arabic. And so these documents, which hadn't been used much as far as the West was concerned, were all of a sudden reintroduced in Spain, North Africa, and all through the western part of Asia. And you had a reinterest in aspects of geometry and geography, of maps and such, because you really hadn't had a lot of access in the West in the last couple of hundred years as the Roman system slowly went downhill. You also had an increase again in literacy, in literature and philosophy. The need to read the Quran meant that people had to learn Arabic. And once you learned Arabic, all of a sudden you were reading works that had been translated into Arabic or written in Arabic, as well as philosophy. Many of the Greek philosophers were translated into Arabic, and people began to read the philosophy again of these. There's a reinterest and a discovery um, in philosophy and literature and the spinning of thought. Now, while it is completely unfair to say there was no philosophy in North Africa and the eastern part of Europe when Islam has arrived, it is, however, correct to say that the schools in North Africa, the Holy Land, and Western Asia were not generally for your common man, but rather those who needed education, for example, doctors, lawyers, and clergymen. Instruction was in Latin almost universally, and thus not easily acceptable. Many of the ancient schools had fallen into disuse or had shut down. The church ran schools, but these offered mostly basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic for the masses. The average man and the woman in the street did not have any serious exposure to literature, philosophy, or any kind of advanced mathematics. Islam, because of its focus on leisure, its importance on reading, again, reading in the Quran, stimulated literacy and interest in philosophy. You also had interest in medicine came around again. Also hygiene, oddly enough. Not that they were necessarily especially dirty in the areas of the tribes coming in, but the idea of health and medicine, of hygiene, that kind of stuff came in this with these manuscripts. Again, you would have manuscripts that were translated in various areas and carried along through the trade routes of the Muslim world and could be accessed and read in all these various places. So the when the Islamic world came in initially, it was very violent, and the takeover was very aggressive. However, over the ensuing centuries, you're going to see um, that a sort of renaissance actually takes place because of the ability to connect. Rome used to have that with the Latin and the Greek, but that had fallen down with the arrival of the Middle Ages and the arrival of the barbarian kings. And you're going to see it. In fact, when we get to the Crusades in several centuries from now, the Crusaders, when they show up in Baghdad, and they show, well, as far as Baghdad, although some of them do, when they show up in the Muslim world, they're kind of shocked at how well educated and how well civilized and cultured a lot of the people were compared to where they were from. Any questions on the Islamic world? All right. I don't hear any noise. I'll keep moving along. The Battle of Tours. Islam seemed unstoppable. The wave of conquest was a veritable juggernaut which swept through North Africa, into Spain, and then into France. Nothing seemed to be able to stop it. The armies of Europe were no longer organized like they were under Rome. The new armies under various kingdoms of early Europe were heavily armored and mostly disorganized. They're used to fighting each other rather than an objective foe. Finally, however, at Tours in southern France, one king was able to halt the Islamic tide, Charles Martel. Martel is the hammer. France in 700 was a collection of duchies which were not unified or organized. Each of the duchies here, and sometimes were even smaller, the duchies were held by individual dukes, hence duchy, and they had their own armies. They had their oftentimes had their own currency. Would even speak a version of their own language. It was really not an organized area of the world. Nothing compared to what had been under Rome for sure. The Battle of Tours happened on the borders between Spain and France, up in the Duchy of Aquitaine here, up into the French area right there. The the Muslim forces that were coming in, they were coming in very, very quickly, and so they didn't necessarily have a lot of supplies or a lot of ability to fight hard, but they were very quick and had this kind of blitzkrieg mentality. The Battle of Tours was fought over several days, and the fighting was quite intense. The two armies could not have been more different, and as a result, the fighting was there were victories on both sides. The European knights being much more heavily armored, however slower, and did not maneuver nearly as well as the coming Muslim armies. What turned the tide was the use of an ancient tactic that had not been used in a long time that Charles Martel figured out he could do, and that was the use of the phalanx, a long line of armor, creating a sort of wall that you couldn't get through. He did so with long lances. He created a line of long lances for which the Muslim army was not able to penetrate. The use of long spears and shields played a key role in the victory of Tours. The Islamic forces were quicker and more organized, but the forces under Charles Martel were able to form long battle lines with long spears, and the Muslim forces were unable to penetrate it and were forced to retreat. Europe was almost literally saved from becoming Islamic by one battle, or it's one war area, the Battle of Tours. But that's how close they got and how decisive the Battle of Tours was. Any questions on that?
So I have kind of a overarching question for this. So you've used terms like Islam or Islamic. Um, to what extent was Islam spreading as a unified religion, or was this like just culturally the Arab Caliphate? Because like in modern history, lots of different nation states are majority Muslim. Um, but not to like I don't think with the Ottoman Empire is it as easy to say like, oh well, it's this is the Ottoman Empire, it's not specifically Islam. But at this point, is this all like an Arab caliphate?
It
Or
is.
like
Yes,
how yeah.
it's a very much a caliphate. So one of the things about Islam, it was almost kind of like Benedictinism, and we'll actually get into that later on, I think even this evening, was that that lots of different kinds of people would take up Islam, would convert to Islam and pick up this, and they would learn Arab and they would learn these things, and they would take and they would further this movement of Islam. So they were not the same people at all. It began in Arabia, but it very quickly picked up um, a lot of these Bedouin type peoples, North African Bedouin peoples, um, Western Asian Bedouin peoples, and it brought with it it brought with it. So obviously, when the fact that someone converts to Islam does not make them wealthy or able to fight a war per se. What it brought with it was when Islam came in, um, it it gave an excuse for conquest, um, and um, it brought with it some money, some knowledge, and people would come through and they would have, I think it came through areas which were culturally very weak and not very organized, and it brought with it an organization that was very attractive and very quickly would come in again. They would see this. These individual peoples would come into contact with this and the fact of belonging, the sense of belonging and the cultural cohesion that Islam offered was very attractive to many of these people, and they went along with it. And again, it fit into the kind of um, Bedouin way of governing, way of society fit very well. And so they picked up Islam and they were able to move along with it and make great strides. You also had a number of warlords and um, chieftains who saw the opportunity to just to take territory for themselves. There was a real sense of I remember talking to someone who was a scholar of Islamic history, something called the SCA, where they actually like put on these personas, and he carried himself as a Muslim. And I had a long conversation with him about these various, key figures in early Muslim history, and the number of people who were. It's almost like when coming to America, you had all these individual. Privateers and fortune seekers and that kind of stuff who would pick up and would go because they figured they could get a stake in whatever area and they could make a name for themselves kind of thing. And you had a lot of that with Islam. It did not have a hierarchy, which we'll get into later in Europe, where you had a very established way of doing things and a chieftain and people like that. It was much more, let's just say, democratic, and there was a lot of opportunity for individual chieftains and warlords to make a name for themselves and gather territory by using the banner of Islam to do it. So I think it was just basically a caliphate, and honestly, quite frankly, it was not it was not nearly as organized initially as it looked like later on. The culture flowed from it, but governmentally, I don't think it was nearly as well organized as people would like to think it was. It was again, there was the caliphates, and you had I mean, there's Sharia law, and again, I'm no expert on Islam, but I do know that there's a saying they have in like very late, well, I guess like maybe like between about 7 and 900 of what is it they say? It's live in a Muslim area but never met a Muslim because they would go through so quickly that you people who were the Muslims themselves didn't necessarily stay around. There was someone that was a Muslim caliph or governor somewhere, but you hadn't met him. Um, but at the same time, the governmental language was Arabic, the currency was Arabic, and so you may not, but your children or your grandchildren at that point in time would have learned Arabic and would have picked up a lot of the cultural elements and would become Muslim, even though necessarily, because you did have, this is especially true in Egypt, Christianity continues. You have Coptic Christianity continues. Um, and they're subject to Islam. They have their freedoms are curtailed, but there are uh, Christianity in certain areas can continue, although they all end up speaking Arabic, and the expressions are becoming increasingly similar to the Muslims because of the cultural influence. That was a long answer to a short question. I apologize. Any other questions or all right, here we go. The rise of Christendom. So, on the other side of the world, where the Muslims are not, back in Europe, something new was happening. Christian kings were establishing Christian kingdoms, and a new political and social system was developing feudalism. Under the Roman system, there were paid professional soldiers. However, the new kings were not able to maintain professional armies like the Romans did. Instead, they earned the loyalty of a man and made a bond of faithfulness with him. Faith in Latin is fides or fidel, faith or faithful. Fidel meaning faithful in Latin. French it's fe or later on foi. Spanish it's fe. Italian is fe, and English is faith. So fidel and fidel becomes feudal, which becomes feudal. So feudalism means faithfulism. Oaths were made to a lord by his vassal. To be faithful in his service, the oath was sworn by placing one's hands inside of the Lord's, and pledge was solemnized by touching the man's shoulders touching him on the shoulders with a sword. So you'd come forward, you'd hold your hands like you're in church there, and the Lord would put his hands around yours, and you would make a pledge to him, and then he would dub you or make you his knight. Sometimes promotions were even made on the field of battle. Men who wanted to be knights sometimes, or who were pages, and I'll get to that in a minute, who were on their way up, young men, learning first of all in service, and then they would be his equerry and take care of his armor, clean his armor, sharpen his sword, keep his horse up, and would be in service for years sometimes under a nobleman until he began to be taught the ways of combat and be taught the manners and expectations of a knight, and then finally he would be given a chance in battle, and if he showed himself worthy, he could be dubbed, and sometimes the dubbings even did happen on the battlefield. A young man who wanted to be a knight would begin around the age of 10. He would become a page of a knight and serve him, taking care of his horse, cleaning his armor, serving in any number of other capacities, even assisting him in battle once he was older. When he was ready, he would be knighted by his lord, and normally this was an elaborate ceremony requiring an all-night vigil with fasting. The next day, the young knight to be attended mass, at the end of which he would make his pledge and receive his knighthood. Famous painting called The Accolade, probably overly romanticized version of dubbing. It isn't to say women never dubbed, but usually it was the Lord. It was the usually the man would do it because he was the Lord who fought in warfare. But again, it wasn't impossible for women to do it. They probably more often not look like this, where the Lord would bring the younger man, the upcoming man, the soldier, and after he'd proven himself as a page for many years in service and cleaning, and got to know his way around the weapons of war, the horses, and everything else, and finally began to get involved in battle and distinguish himself, was made a knight by his Lord. Pages, and you see here of different, would do all these various tasks in service to lords as they grew up. Usually boys in their early, late, about 10 in their teenage years, and by the end of the teenage years, they became ready to don armor and learn the trade of a knight. And you can see the lower left corner. This still exists today in England. You have pages to lords, although they really don't do much military service any longer. The hierarchy, thus, of the medieval Europe was very triangular. You had the king on the top, um, who often initially they would kings were distinguished by military service, and a king was the best soldier, and he would have men loyal to him, and he would be crowned king. Obviously, once a king is crowned, he wants his son to follow in his footsteps, or one of his sons, usually the eldest one, and they would continue on militarily. And obviously, as time goes along, the military service is still required, and as late as the 1600s, kings still are trained in military service, although they're much less likely to fight. And then obviously right below the king would be his lords. Um, and there was actually a whole different, I couldn't find a slide. There's a whole thing about, um, there's baron, there's an earl or count, earl in England, count in the continent. Um, Viscount, count, and then a marquis, and then a duke. And in fact, I might even look in the next sim, see if I can find the breakdown of that. And each of those has to do with where and how you are. It's land. You have land, and your call is to protect the people, protect the defense against, as they say, enemies both foreign and domestic. You're the nobles in the various areas are vowed to protect the people under them. You can see that even as late as like Downton Abbey with the Earl of Grantham, and he's got the castle there, and his job was to make sure that the people of his area were protected from, again, enemies both foreign and domestic. Under them, you would have lesser lords. So under your marquises and your dukes, you're going to have lesser lords, so that when a king calls his men and a duke shows up, oftentimes he will have several lesser nobles who fight for him. Um, and again, these men aren't necessarily paid. They've just simply sworn loyalty to their lord, and they have lands, and these lands allow them to make a living as best they can. But it really isn't as much pay as you had under Rome. It was much more a matter of honor and position and the owning of land. Um, and finally, obviously, you go down, you have people who actually work the land, the both the serfs, the craftsmen, and that kind of stuff down there. So you can see, um, one of the things you will notice is not here and will not be here for a little while still are merchants, people who buy and sell. Right now, these are the peasants who work the land. You have your butcher, your baker, and your candlestick maker, are among the serfs. But these are things, generally speaking, that are made locally, or perhaps between village to village. You don't really have any kind of merchants yet, buying and selling in this area of Europe at this point in time. A little bit of it, but really, it's very limited. Any questions about feudalism? I don't hear any questions, so I'll keep moving. One of the great legends that comes around, we don't exactly know when, but it's about this time, is the English legend of King Arthur. King Arthur is a fascinating interlude into the medieval world and gives us a real sense of what the medieval world was like, because Arthur, who is a Christian and is sees after the Holy Grail and has all the Christian ideals, is surrounded by pagan tropes and pagan ideas, but all of them seem to be more or less at the service of Christianity. So one of the first great Christian epics is the legend of King Arthur and the Round Table and the quest for the Holy Grail, and we have no way of knowing if any of it is true. No one has ever found the grave of King Arthur. No one has ever found anything about King Arthur. We do not know for a fact of exactly when he lived or how it all worked. It is all legend, but the legend is very, very carefully worked out, so it may be true. But anyway, we have no idea. But it is an example of the Christianization of England. While it is replete with Christian symbolism, paganism is still very much present, but is at the service of the Christian faith. Merlin, who is an enchanter, is almost more pagan than Christian. He has a magical birth, has powers, and is very involved in getting Arthur his birthright and such. Yet is practically almost more of a pagan sorcerer, any kind of a Christian priest. Yet he is in service to Arthur and assists him in who he is, in his birthright, and in his quest. So Merlin, being very much a pagan trope of a wizard type figure, ultimately is at the service of Arthur. Arthur and the pulling of the stone out of the sword in the stone here. The Disney had the best images, so we don't actually know, but apparently a sword was put into the stone and only Arthur could take it out. And there's a whole legend surrounding the fact that many tried and Arthur came around and I don't know, according to the Disney one, it almost comes loose by in his hand as if it's specifically for him. Obviously, we don't know exactly how any of that happened, but the idea that Arthur came along and was destined to be this king was able to pull the sword out of the stone. You also had the Lady Avalon, the Lady of the Lake. It was a whole myth of Avalon and these women of Avalon, and Arthur coming along, needing the sword, gets the lady. The hand comes out of the lake and gives Arthur the sword. Very much a nod to the idea of the Celtic goddesses, the goddess religion. I don't know much about. I'm not all that familiar with paganism, but the idea of the goddess and the idea of Avalon and this magical island, and yet it is to Arthur that the island is its service. So you can see very much pagan tropes dating back from Celtic mythology and pre-Christian England, and yet all of this seems to ultimately be at the service of or to assist Arthur in his quest to become the king that he must be, and for his quest for the Grail and such. Arthur and Excalibur, as the legend goes, Arthur broke the sword that he took out of the stone. And Sir Merlin instructed him to go to Avalon, where a woman's arm came out of the lake with Excalibur, and thus Arthur was prepared to rule England and to complete his quest. Again, several pagan tropes at the service of Christianity. It's a fascinating piece. You see a little bit of it a bit in Scandinavia. It's very much a northern thing. You don't really have anything like this in France or Italy or Spain. This idea of this magical ambiance, people coming forward, magical powers and helping him out, and yet it's Christianity and a Christian spirit and Christian goal. All of this is oriented, so you can see how England is being converted, and these stories, which will rival the Lord of the Rings later on, are all centered around this idea. You can even see it in Lord of the Rings. There's no priests in Lord of the Rings. People always tell me about how bad Harry Potter is, and I say, there's Lord of the Rings has very much the same ambiance of it's a Christian ideal, and they're clearly Christian principles, but you almost have paganism at the service of it. The Arthurian ideal was a contrast between the Christian knight ideal, which was developing, with the equality between knight and lord, which was disappearing, added with the Grail, which is a powerful Christian image in Britain. So the idea of the Arthur being almost like a Jesus figure with his knights sitting around him in the round table, unlike many of the knights in Europe or the kings in Europe, which were much more of a top-down kind of art thing. Um, Arthur sits around the table with his knights, and they have say, and they argue, and they do what have you. It's very both symbolic of the period in which it was written and the ideas of knighthood and such were which were gaining strength in this age. Any questions about the age of King Arthur or the King of King Arthur? I don't hear anything, so I will keep moving. The Vikings. About this time, we have the beginnings of the incursion of the Northmen. Scandinavian warriors came out of the north beginning in the 700s. Their society did not allow much upward mobility, and legends of the wealth of Christian lands led many northerners to venture down to England, Scotland, and France in search of treasure. I'll cover more in the next section, but I want to introduce them as the first invasions begin in 700s. The 8 and 900s is really when the Vikings really are we'll probably be able to cover it this evening. Um, would come out of and really begin to colonize, but the first incursions begin in the 700s. Vikings were a very unique form of warrior and did not use any of the types of battle techniques that the West was used to. Um, you have berserkers, the idea of covering yourself in animal skins, which will allow them a certain level of camouflage, as well as the fear factor. And the fear factor would be very, very high in Viking fighting technology. But the berserkers that came out of these things warriors would land on the shores of England and Scotland and such, and the Westerners really had no idea what to do with these fierce warriors. Vikings did not fight with not with much organization, but with ferocity. The idea of charging in, the idea of taking fear, they was what they really prized. They prized dying in battle, which made them very brave. This was something the Westerners had not dealt with before. Was men who were not afraid of death, who would charge in and would attack areas and not fear being killed, and did not have the idea of dying was for them was a great honor. So the men would have an extraordinary amount of bravery in areas where Western knights were much more afraid. Anyway, more to come on the Vikings next century, but the first incursions were made at this time. Any questions about the incursions of the Vikings? All right. Dynasties. So one of the difficulties of this age was the founding of dynasties. Kings wanted to both protect their lands and squires, but also to secure their heritage and their names. Sometimes good kings are doing bad things to establish their dynasties. So we have France and England at this point in time are a series of duchies, and each of these duchies is a duke, and most of those dukes wouldn't mind being the king of the whole area. Obviously, they also want their children to inherit the area and to continue on. So while these men were Christians and believed in God and such, at the same time, they knew that first of all they had some ambitions. They also knew that their fellow dukes had ambitions, and so there was constant tension regarding this. In England, King Ethelred ruthlessly sought to unite England under his reign. He battled other kings, made dynastic marriages, and to accomplish his purpose. They do a very good job of this in the show Vikings, actually, talking about how him and Aela and some of the other kings, they all knew there was only so much territory. Who was going to be the top ruler? And you had all kinds of deals made, and good and bad faith things were carried out for the sake of that. In France, the Carolingians made plans to usurp the Merovingians, who had become weak rulers, especially after Charles Martel's victory over the Muslims. So in France, you have a whole series of duchies, and the Merovingians, who were the ones who were in charge. We covered Merovech last time, and you had he was the head of there, but there were several dukes in these ducal families. Charles Martel, later on Charlemagne, and the Merovingians. I don't recall who was the thing. The exact leader of that, but these individual. You also had other ones like like Burgundians and other various areas in France, and each of these areas was a duchy, but it made it very fragmented, and they realized that more centralized rule would be good. The question is, who would be the top dog? If there ever was any truth to the term Dark Ages, it was here. Kings fought each other for control and consolidation. Sons betrayed fathers. Wives, husbands, as families sought to consolidate territory with their family in charge. This would continue for centuries and is somewhat of a dark spot on the history of Christian Europe. You can see it as late as 11 and 1200s when they're building the Crusades, and you can see the religious orders and the church being so strong and the Christian faith being practiced almost universally. Still, the idea of these dynasties and the idea of settling on who was going to be the top king caused a number of kings or dukes and such to do what nowadays would be quite scandalous. So this is an area of it's necessary to understand it in its context, because if you look back, you say, how could they do this? And politics, I mean, politics is a dirty game nowadays, even. And sometimes when you are, trying to secure your heritage, the difficult decisions were made, and they weren't always good. All right, we're going to go on to the 800s in a few minutes here. The Vikings, they continue. Charlemagne, the continuation, and further evangelization. All right, so we'll probably get out a little bit early this evening. Believe me, that will not always be the case. I've got one other century, and I've got about another probably 45 or so minutes for that. So um, let's take a little bit of it. Any questions regarding anything in the 700s, first of all? All right, let's take about 5-10 minutes here for a nature break, and we'll go at it again. Come on. There we are. All right. Whoops. All right, well, we're still coming back. I'll give him another minute or two here.
Amelia, I have an announcement. I have been very naughty.
All right. Like we're all back. You ready for another century? Yeah. All right. Off we go. So the ninth century, very exciting century. Um, you see a real change and real coagulation in it's fascinating. Well, I'll get into this. I won't spoil my thing too much. Off we go. So the Vikings we start off with. We began the story of the Vikings last century, but the 800s is truly their expanding of their territory, and their influence in earnest. The Vikings originate from northern Scandinavia, as opposed to the Anglos and Saxons who were from lower Scandinavia. This was a land of real beauty, waterways, mountains, and lush valleys, plus the haunting and fascinating northern lights or aurora borealis. Fascinating side note: Aurora Borealis is Latin. There actually is no word for north in Latin. I was back in my Latin mass days. There's like three different words used in the Bible for northern, and none of them agree. Borealis is another version of that. Side note that nobody cares about. Scandinavia, the most northern part of Europe. Actually, at some point you actually break into the Arctic Circle, and you've got whole days where it's sunny all day long, other areas where it's dark all day long. This area was at the extreme north of Europe, not not easy trading routes, so it was left out of much of the advantages of the rest of Europe. It wasn't on the way to anywhere. So areas of France and Germany and Italy, getting up to Scandinavia was not easy. And it was quite a journey. And when you got up there, there wasn't necessarily a whole lot to do. So the whole area of Scandinavia was culturally very different from much of the rest of Europe. They were rougher people, very clannish people, and a very different mentality and way of doing things than the rest of Europe. Scandinavia as it was in the year 800. Various kings had fought for control of the various areas. It was briefly united under one crown, but for the most part, it was a series of jarls warring. And yes, your ears serve you right. Jarl is where we get the word earl from in England. Um, Trying to gain control of the various areas. Although honestly, there was not a lot of there was far less infighting than you might think, just because there wasn't a whole lot to get. There wasn't that much gold and things like that, and so it was a beautiful area, but not especially rich in gold and silver, and not on any trading routes. So they were really left out of a lot of things, and so. The thirst for the idea of a quest and going elsewhere became very, very popular. The area was gorgeous, though. The fjords with the rivers navigating this, they became a very seafaring people very quickly. And the villages oftentimes run on the edge of seaboards, almost more for communication than for trade. Obviously, there was farming, but there was also a lot of fishing and a lot of other things to do with or animal herding because the area was very sparse, probably a lot like Scotland. The Northern Lights, which are absolutely a stunning view made the area to be almost kind of haunting. And many of the gods and goddesses are the Valkyries and the various things. Airborne spirits are relatively common with these northern peoples. The idea of the air and spirits and that kind of stuff, and the power of the gods. The main village were replete with shops and places where craftsmen labored at their work. Viking villages were very self-contained and had everything that they needed relatively nearby. There was not a lot of travel involved. At the center of a Viking village was the Longhouse, which was an important building in the village where the main community meal was taken, and longhouses where government business was done by the Jarl or Viking lord. So obviously every family had their own house, but oftentimes, regularly, Vikings would meet together in the Longhouse. Business was done there, and meals were taken there, especially after any kind of a journey, any kind of a battle or anything. They would get together in the long houses. So there certainly were individual family farms and such, but the sense of community among the Vikings, getting together and doing things together, eating together, fighting and working together, was very, very strong these northern peoples. The Viking longhouse had a special flavor to it. It looked very Viking, very clean lines, not necessarily even necessarily made of finished carpeting. The wood was relatively rough, but well fitted and well put together, and it had a very unique, a very specific cultural way that they would build these things. The inside of a Viking longhouse was extremely multi-purpose, allowed for cooking, allowed for eating, and allowed for business. The northern, again, one of the reasons why longhouses are also very popular is because it gets very cold, and you go to an individual farm and be able to get a fire going to keep in your individual farmhouse to keep yourself warm, probably requiring a lot of effort. It would be much easier to go to the longhouse. There's a fire pit in the center where the food was cooked. There were tables along where you could eat, and again, you people, well, the village business was talked about. You see a lot of that. I realize this is a pub, almost like in Lord of the Rings, where they'd go and they would dance around the tables and such. The idea of coming to the longhouse and getting business done in the longhouse was very, very common. And again, the idea of being around the community and doing things together as in their groups. You can see here more again the seating and that kind of stuff and the way the longhouse was laid out. This is extremely important for the understanding of how um, Viking culture and Viking religion would grow in the sense that it is very it's almost like the Scots where you have your individual clans, your individual groups would have their own hierarchies and would be somewhat resistant to outside influences telling them what to do, and it was all about taking care of your family and your clan. And the longhouse was a very visible symbol of this kind of a society. Another example from the show Vikings, which is actually pretty good, showing the kind of the getting together, the meals, and the kind of tight society that you had among the Vikings. The various men would vying for place or what have you, um, and would all of it would defer back finally to the Jarl and his family and such. Again, this it's all from the series Vikings here, but they did a very fairly good job of both the society that they lived in and as well as the idea that they were they were isolated. We're an isolated people, and many of their manners and their habits are a result of this isolation, which is why you have this strong sense of getting together in community and holding together was because of this isolation. You really couldn't survive on your own. So being being in the society and being society sociable and such was very, very important for the Viking society. Another example here of going to the Earl and beseeching business and such, and going and being this is you can see here. This was I think Ragnar when he first does his thing. You can see there the gold and silver that had been taken from a Viking raid on Christian lands. Viking farms contained most of what a family needed to survive, but still villages would specialize in something: meat, dairy, iron. You actually would oftentimes have certain villages where they would specialize and make larger quantities of things. Again, the your individual farmhouse would have what you needed for your family, and you would do your farming or you would do what have you, but you would take it to the main village to sell. But then again, the waterways around the fjords and such allowed for trading back and forth. And so you had this idea of certain villages would specialize in dairy, would specialize in various kinds of farming and meats, would specialize in iron. Obviously, the Vikings being a warrior type people would have would learn making of weapons and that kind of stuff. But again, you have the longhouse for the period. You have a number of individual farms, which would make up this Viking village, and you would have areas which would specialize in certain things. For the upkeep of all, and again, certain villages would Vikings would actually would be better at making swords, for example, and would sell them to the other villages. Viking villages, each village has its own unique flavor and style. You can see some of the areas there are much more richly decorated and much more indicative of this kind of Viking ideal. And others of them, and I think they're kind of the ones that are closer to the water. The farther you get away from the water, the poorer they get. But some of them actually became very nice. Vikings were actually known for fashion, were known for hygiene, were known for for making of jewelry and the like, and some of their swords and weapons were more ornate than some of those in continental Europe. The Vikings, even though they were an isolated people, really had a sense of their culture and a sense of being Viking and the idea of arts. And again, you had some of your earliest the sagas and the writings and that kind of stuff were all Vikings. So there's a real sense of where they come from, their gods, and then again, there's a real sense of almost like fashion and culture that was very strong among the Vikings. Other areas, again, farther up into the hills and farther away from the water, are going to be far poorer, which is again why you have treks down to joining in the longhouse, where this family, for example, probably doesn't have as much. They can get down to the main village, into the longhouse, and eat well. The other farm we saw a second ago, they may have more to contribute. But again, they're all part of the same tribe, and so they're going to share their food, and they're going to share this idea, of taking care of everybody is actually very innate in the Viking mentality. And so this idea of loving your neighbor and taking care of them, it's already in their culture, even as pagans before Christianity arrives, and so picks up very quickly. The idea of everybody needs to be able to eat so that we can all be strong as soldiers and go off and do what we have to do. So both richer and poorer farm areas would still benefit from the whole. The Vikings were people raised on ideologies of war. Society was based on a warrior code, and the deities of their mythology were gods of war. They had farms and raised animals primarily, and crops secondarily. Again, the area was rough. It was not necessarily really good for serious farming, but their real passion was battle, pillaging, and raiding. By the beginning of the ninth century, they had colonized all of Scandinavia and the islands of the North Sea. So, beginning in the ninth century, these Viking warriors began making excursions into England, Ireland, and France. So here, as you can see, the map of all the areas that had been colonized by the Vikings at this time. So the north, all the northern islands, Greenland, Iceland, all these areas already had been colonized, and Viking colonies existed in all of them. But again, these are all rougher areas. These are colder northern areas, and were not really what the Vikings were looking for. But they became exceedingly good at sea travel. And one of the things about Viking ships was that they did not sit deep into the water. They sat fairly shallow, and they put all the men in there, and they could lay down and take turns take turns either sleeping or working the rigging or the rigging or whatever, and able to travel long distances, weeks at a time, or at least many days at a time at sea. They had their rations on board there, and they would able to sail. I mean, there's talk of them actually getting to America long before Columbus and his ilk. But their knowledge and their ability to navigate these waters around here, it was extraordinary. They could travel very long distances and still be ready for war. The boats were, as I just said, they were not deep into the water. They were long and they were wide, and they were able to row them or both row them and have sails. This allowed them also to navigate the rivers of both England and France, which really scared the heck out of the Europeans, because you were far up the river and you never thought anything bad would happen. And here comes this boat with these northerners, and they'd hop off and they'd raid villages and monasteries and everything else wherever gold could be gotten. And again, the Viking ships were very thin. Were very thin, were very lightweight, sat high in the water, and contained a number of soldiers, and thus they were very deadly with their ability at sea. Viking warriors, the technique of the German peoples, ferocity, surprise, and this kind of blitzkrieg or lightning war. The Vikings sort of unexpectedly fought with savagery and bravery and were gone almost as fast as they came. This strategy terrorized the lands of England, France, and Ireland for the next century. These people lived in fear of Viking raids. It really was. There's an interesting story about how the Vikings found out that the idea of the tritone, the idea of this devil's tone, the devil was coming, and they would blow it and let them know, and they would run away. But they would sack monasteries, they would sack various villages, and there are horror stories of anything of like a whole convent of nuns hearing the Vikings were coming, and they all cut off their noses so the Vikings wouldn't want to rape them. You have horrific stories from this period. Vikings warriors often fought with little or no armor. Again, the idea was quickness, speed. They were taught to not be afraid of pain. These were men who were raised in a very cold and tough environment. Also, armor weighed them down. So oftentimes you would find, and like the Celtic warriors did some of the same things, but they would get themselves all worked up, and therefore they wouldn't be cold, and they would go in there, and it made them very fast and do this with the use of weapons and such. They also would oftentimes hit little villages and monasteries with people who were not especially well armed, so it wasn't necessarily all that dangerous for them. But they were known, part of their speed came in the fact they fought with little or no armor. As we saw last time, some of them would take and would cover themselves with animal hides. Which acted a little bit as armor, but again also and some camouflage. And it also scared to death the Europeans who would see these people coming up with bears, wearing bear coats or what have you, and coming in and into trying to do to pillage and that kind of thing. They did wear armor, and this is a little bit later here. It was often leather armor, skins. It was made of skin. It was leather armor more so than metal armor. And again, obviously, fur was always very popular with them. They had the also the idea you see the braiding of the hair and the pulling. That's actually fairly true. They braided their hairs. They would shave their heads. They say hygiene was actually very prized among the Vikings. I think it also had to do with the fact that they were seafaring. So getting in the water and cleaning was very easy to do because you had plenty of fresh water. But the idea, and again, they were very good at making belts, and they were very good at making, bodices and this kind of stuff. They were talented also in some metal work. So you had Viking armor, which was mostly wool, was often tooled and very fancy. Women in the Viking era have been somewhat misrepresented. They're shields maidens. Were they trained to fight in battle? Yes. Did they go on raids? No. They they protected villages. They were men knew that they didn't that they were not in no match for any kind of serious warfare. They also were the ones that they valued them. They did not want them going off and being maimed or hurt or whatever in battle. So they were the ones that they protected the home and hearth. However, they absolutely were trained in techniques of combat the same way the men were. They absolutely knew how to use swords and shields, but they used it as defense, not an offensive. They were the defensive line of the Vikings, but they absolutely did learn to fight, and absolutely were able to use again the leather armor, the sword, and the shield, but they did not do it in offensive things. They also had some of the makeup or what have you. The idea of making themselves look ferocious in battle was a thing, but again, it was only really used for defense. It was, however, and I'll go into in a second here, was once you have settlements set up in England, set up in Scotland, and set up in France. Once you have Viking settlements, women would come in, so they would be in foreign areas, and European people might attack. And so there were fights. Women were involved in it, but it was again mostly the matter of either defending the homeland or defending the settlements once these settlements got established. Viking settlements were almost like small Viking villages where they would set up. They would wall them off, put them in strategic places by waterways or areas where they could get in and out with their boats very easily. They could pull in and they would set up and they would have a longhouse. They would have their various places, the tents or places to build, depending on how serious the settlement was, whether it was tent or whether it was wood built. But Viking settlements were set up there, and once they dug in like this, they would defend themselves, and they could be very dangerous, and they could be very difficult to get rid of. And from there, they could travel further inland. So initially, these were raids, either coastal raids or in rivers. Once they set up a settlement, they could come back and they could use that as a base of operation, and they could go even further inland. So they became even more dangerous in that regard. But again, every settlement was set up like a Viking village, was self-contained, and was able to live off of the surrounding area, and of course anything that was brought back to it. Viking settlements along England between the first incursions up until almost the Middle Ages, and you can see here how they come in and they take over what is effectively the east coast of England and areas of Ireland. This one doesn't go into France, but you can see here how between the Dane and the Norse, these and again there are these are almost competing individual aspiring jarls, aspiring chieftains who would go off. Again, there was only so much space in the northern countries. Young men who wanted to make a name for themselves, sons of jarls who their father wasn't dying fast enough and they wanted their own land, would go off and come to England in these islands here and would come in there and set up settlements. They would take their, loyal people loyal to them, and they would come in and they would set up and they would create these settlements. And then again, once a settlement was created, they could move farther inland. So you can see how much of England is taken by these Northmen. The Danelaw, finally, the kings of England are going to realize that they simply do not have the ability, they're not organized enough, and don't have the military strategy. Again, the Vikings, by the time you go back to them, the Vikings do a raid, they attack an area, they do damage, they take stuff, and they go back to their thing. If you're going to go fight them, you've got to go to the settlement to take them on at their home. You're not likely to catch them in a raid. So chances are, when the kings of England went up there to try and get rid of them, they saw them coming. Several settlements pulled together, and now you're facing hundreds of Danish warriors, northern warriors, and the English weren't able to take that on. They did not have they were not organized enough to take on what was otherwise a relatively organized army of northerners. And so very quickly they made peace with them and gave them portions of England. That portion was called the Danelaw, and actually the Danelaw existed well into the Middle Ages. So the idea of these Northerners coming in, becoming part of England, becoming part of the English landscape, becomes a very real thing for their setup. And later on, you will actually have kings who will be Danish. So the Danelaw becomes a very real part of England. Any questions about Viking settlements and the spread of the Scandinavian peoples into England? All right, I don't hear anything, so we'll continue on. Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike the events of the 4th century, 300, the crowning of Charlemagne was a watershed moment in church history. The Eastern emperors were unable to provide either leadership or military support to the West, and this left the West in desperate need of order, structure, and might. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, the son of Charles Martel, was chosen on account of his leadership skills to become the Emperor of the West, a title that had been dead for almost 400 years. His coronation by the Pope signaled a new era in European history. He is crowned by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in 800. Charlemagne requested this, the idea that the church was going to give validation to his emperorship. And this idea again, this was the idea that he was no longer just a king. All right, again, the Pope we saw last week how the papacy and the church are giving validation, God's blessing to kings and to the hierarchy of Europe. Many of these dukes that we looked at last time were fighting who was going to be on top, who was going to be the top one. And by Charlemagne was having the Pope come and crown him in 800 is really a signal moment of we have a central leader, we have someone who's in charge, who's at the top. Charlemagne means Charles the Great. He set up his court and his laws like unto Rome. He sought to establish a new Western empire. Very much the idea of recapturing what Rome had lost. The people still read enough Latin and had enough of the architecture and the residual elements of the Roman Empire to dream about how grandiose and glorious Rome once was, and by God, they wanted that back. And Charlemagne was going to come in, and there was a real sense of we can do this again. We can bring this back. So there was a lot of hope in the crowning of Charlemagne, for the court of Charlemagne to reestablish a Western empire that rivaled that, especially of Constantinople, and possibly that even of the original Rome. Das Heiliges Römische Reich, or the Holy Roman Empire. The empire was a valiant attempt to recapture what the Roman Empire was, but it was not the same thing. Heritage laws and family squabbles would plague it, plus the administration would be an absolute nightmare. Still, Europe had begun something that would endure. The Dark Ages were officially over, and the Middle Age or High Middle Age had begun, although it would not see fruition for another 4 or 5 generations. This was mostly an idea. This was mostly a dream. This was mostly a a pilot light starting of a fire that would grow. So while Charlemagne was crowned, that did not necessarily mean that every duke or every what have you in France and Germany were going to submit to him. They recognized that he was in charge now, but there was still going to be a difficulty of how to navigate all of the various areas of this shattered and fractured previous Roman Empire and how they were going to bring it to heel under a central leader. What also happens is that the the sons of Charlemagne were going to each want their piece of it, and we're not necessarily going to be happy submitting to one of their brothers. Here was the area of the Holy Roman Empire, all of what was France, much of what was Italy, all of what was Belgium and the northern parts up there, and much of what is now Germany. We're all contained in this Holy Roman Empire. It even had some of the Slavs on the far right would come in there. Again, the idea of the unification of the area was very, very seductive. One of the things also about the Holy Roman Empire is the fact that it was German wasn't as scary in some senses to a lot of these northern peoples. They spoke German. The Latin was used, and there was Latin around, but German was also used. It was a northern kingdom, and the northern peoples felt that they really had a chance to do something, to make something. This was their chance to create an empire like Rome had done previously, which they were kept out of. This was their opportunity to make their mark and to make a northern kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire, possibly better than the first. The Carolingian Renaissance. There was a lot of energy was put into building the culture of this empire. They really wanted to put it together to make it, and again, they were also threatened and inspired by the cultural cohesion that was happening down south in the area of the Muslims. And again, they were inspired by what Rome had done. So from architecture to language and learning, to military tools and training, Charlemagne sought to make the Holy Roman Empire the envy of every other cultures. He brought in Alcuin of York, an Englishman, was brought in to teach and to update the structure of learning. He introduced schools, updated the Latin script then in use, and created the Carolingian minuscule or uncial. Alphabet was much more readable than its predecessors and became the standard for the empire. One of the things that you had toward the end of the Roman Empire was this fracturing of writing. Writing got sloppy. The quality of the Latin suffered oftentimes. Some manuscripts were very, very difficult to read because anywhere from, the Gaul, the Frankish Gaul, to the Anglo-Saxon, to on and on and on, each of them writing in their own version of Latin, it became very, very difficult not only to read, oftentimes, but to even understand what was being written. So there was a real lack of literacy or a failing off of literacy, and the Carolingian Renaissance sought to bring that back. Alcuin of York, the monk who came in from England and set the schools in order and brought back and tried to bring back the learning and increase the learning of the Carolingian Empire. One of the first things they did was to standardize the way that they wrote, something called the Carolingian minuscule. Lowercase writing, because uppercase was difficult to do. This was able to write more easily, and it was standardized. So the alphabet was taken and was standardized to make it be able to be usable across the empire. That anybody who would write this, you could be taught, and it would made the documents more readable. It increased the quality of the readability of the Latin, and it made it culturally united the areas under Charlemagne. The Carian minuscule became the standard and default script of the Holy Roman Empire and then of Western Europe. This was the way the documents were written, and it became much more legible, and so literacy improved. People began to read more. The schools, both predominantly monastic schools, but there were also other kinds of schools, and children were taught at a very early age with this script, and were taught the Latin, and thus literacy began to improve tremendously. And again, communication from England all through the Holy Roman Empire, and then down even into Italy and Spain and such, the ability of communication expanded greatly, and travel became much more common. You could go from one area to another because the way the Latin was written and the way it was spoken was standardized, so people could be much better understood. So this really improved the culture of Europe, allowed them to pass around manuscripts in writing. Music was the same way. A lot of the arts and communication, which had fallen apart in these fragmented duchies, was finally able to be reunited and made more standardized throughout the Carolingian Empire. One of the greater problems, though, of the empire had to do with dynastic issues, and it was the custom of the Franks, and Charlemagne was a Frank, that every son got something. This was not the case in England. It was not the case later on in France. But in England, the first son gets everything, and the rest of the sons, well, they'll get a living, they'll get money, but they've got to go make their own living. Only the first son is the actual heir. So you don't have the fragmenting of the empire the same way. Interesting footnote. Winston Churchill was actually a lesser son of, I think, was it the Duke of Marlborough, but he was not the first son, therefore he inherited nothing, therefore he had to make his own way. However, the Franks, every son got something. I don't know if it was an equal part. I know they got. I think the older got a bit more. But anyway, if they all got something, and so the empire would thus shatter after Charlemagne's death. The unification, the cultural unification to a point would continue on, but administrative cohesion collapsed. Would be a problem that would plague Frankish kingdoms. Um, or Germany was called in 1870. Obviously, France is in there also, but you can see France even backing off at this point in time. But the the area of Charlemagne's empire, culturally, we would remain relatively strong. Administratively, would absolutely collapse. And by the time of his death, and even a few years after, the individual small, because again, every single one of his sons has sons, and each of those sons wants a share. And so, very, very quickly, within 100 years of Charlemagne's death, the territory that he controlled and that this once unified area would be utterly shattered administratively. Individual dukes taking up, possibly even minting their own money. Local dialects would develop. So, what started with Charlemagne as far as a dream of an empire did not last at all administratively, because of this inheritance law where each of his sons gets a piece. The sons do not necessarily want to work together, and so it collapses, and there is no administrative cohesion to the Holy Roman Empire whatsoever, and really wouldn't. In fact, that's what I saw. That Germany, it wasn't until 1870 that this area was really united. Otherwise, it was a series of independent duchies. And you can see here the Frankish kingdoms all broken down into the individual duchies and such. Any questions about the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire? All right. I hear crickets. I will keep going. The new evangelization. The days of St. Patrick, who went off by himself and converted Ireland, or Hilda of Whitby, where her little area, and she was able to control and bring to heal princes and call synods, are over. Evangelization is now an industry. Benedictine monks and nuns are set to start monasteries in countries. Evangelization is no longer a discovery of faith, but an acceptance of a structure. One of the things that Charlemagne did was the adoption of Benedictine monasticism as the standard throughout all of his empire. Every monastery had to be Benedictine. There were no other any other options, which created again a standard for cultural standard for how monasteries would be, and allowed monks to travel extensively in and around there. And you'd go anywhere you went in, you knew how they spoke, you knew the structure of the monastery. So it allowed a great deal of of mobility, of moving around. In fact, this would be later in the Middle Ages. You have, Anselm in England is Italian, but he can leave Italy and go to England, and culturally, it's very much the same. So culturally, there was a real cohesion about it. But Benedictine monasticism became a very large machine. You could enter in any monastery you want. You'd learn the ways of Benedictinism, and then you could travel and go around. The Pope sent out monks. These monks put up foundations in whatever country or area, and the country converts and submit to the papacy. It works, but it also creates problems. So the machine of Christianity had become an amazing thing, and the efficiency of it in many ways was very, very powerful. Benedictine monasticism created a system for evangelization. It was very efficient, but it did not leave a lot of room for variety or individual influence, either from a national or personal perspective. So you had the idea of being a hermit, the idea of um, even deviating from the way that the Christianity was practiced was not really welcome, and many people came in, and there were very many monks, and you had large monastic foundations, and Christianity was practiced at the parish level, and it was very well controlled and very well organized. But again, some of the adventurous souls of previous eras. This was not in this area something you could do. It had become very much a well-oiled. Christianity was a well-oiled machine. Abbots and abbesses were blessed and put in place to continue the established practices. This result of the Carolingian structure influenced all of Europe. So what you're going to see here is that all of France and all of Germany, even the northern Italy, this whole vast area is all under the same practice, that it's Christianized, and Christianity is sowed into the soil. Anyone who wants to learn anything is going to go to a Christian school. The administration is thoroughly Christian, so it is a Christianization of the German lands. And if it's done so at the um, done by bishops, it's done by abbots, it's done by abbesses. Young women are raised up, they're sent to the abbatial schools and taught. The same thing with men. And so it allows for a very efficient and very thorough Christianization. And if in a matter of a century or two, with the ensuing generations, the entire area is Christian, and the culture is thoroughly imbued with the Christian faith, the Christian practices, and this kind of stuff. That is one of the things that this organization, this profound and very efficient organization of religion created in the German areas. All right. Next century, we get into Christian Europe, evangelist north, and the beginnings of the monastic revivals. Any questions, therefore, on the 800s?
I do.
Yes.
What's going on with the languages? Because you mentioned that we've got a common alphabet and we've got monasticism spreading throughout Europe. I'm assuming that Latin is really strong there, but amongst the common people, because you had the Germanic languages up there, uh, I mean, today we've got the French and Italian and that. What was happening? Do you know?
Um, that's a very good question. It was not nearly as organized as you might think. Um,
Mhm.
there were at least two versions of French at this point in time, Languedoc and Languedoc, which were southern and northern French. There were obviously different versions of German. Um, the Latin, and again, it's hard to say who did and who did not learn Latin because you almost everybody got exposed to it in the various schools. And most people went to at least a little bit of schooling, so you were exposed to it and probably understood some of it. But there was a lot of localities in languages and very because again you didn't have um you had writing was standardized, and even then, you see differences in spellings of French. I remember studying French, and this is as late as 1500, so this is centuries still. In the same manuscript, you'll see differences in spellings. So it was the languages were probably very local. Um, Between German, various versions of Italian, Latin was still spoken in some areas. Um, you didn't really have coordinated vernaculars. You had language groups, um, and obviously the German dialects, although you very much had dialects. Um, it was um, anybody who was going to be a traveler and he was going to become educated and move around would end up using Latin. So I think most of your languages were local dialects. You had dialects, the Italic dialects. You had French dialects. The French of this age is, if you were to look at, and I've seen like the Our Father written in French from about the 800. It is not modern French by any stretch. You can kind of read it. Um, but it is not it's still languages are still very much in their infancy, uh developing from the various nations that are involved. I don't know what Charlemagne's German sounded like. um I do know that he was not very good at writing. Apparently he was a very bad writer, and he tried all his life to learn to write, was never very successful. um but at the same time, you're absolutely right. Between um, what we have, Hochdeutsch and Bassdeutsch or whatever, high and low German in that area. Um, the As much as we'd like to say that culturally, I think that there was a lot of cohesion among the educated peoples and among the church and among monasteries. I really think that when you got into individual areas, you see that in France, even you go through France, and some of the names of the villages won't make any sense. And you'll ask a local, like, what does this village mean? Oh, it's an old word for something. I remember I was in a village called Chimeret-le-Roi. I'm like, what's a chimeret? And they said it's an old word for chambre or chamber of the king. And I'm thinking, huh? But so I think you had a lot of local dialects. One of the things about Europe, and I don't know anything deeply about this, was that Europeans will oftentimes speak more than one language. If they travel around, you go to Europe and you'll run into a Frenchman, and most Frenchmen will speak at least some English. Obviously, English is kind of the dominant, idiom for the world right now. But they'll speak some Spanish. They'll speak some Italian. You find French over in Burgundy Coast and over by Alsace. They'll speak German. So I mean, they may not speak it well, but the idea of people as they got educated, learning other dialects of their language or other languages, and again, obviously Latin, well, was not uncommon. I don't honestly know percentage wise of let's say, what average person would, how much learning would they get versus their own language. I really don't know. Um, I do know that there is more and more travel happening in this era, and more. So this is 800. So by 1100, Bernard of Clairvaux, who I'll get to later on, writes a commentary on the Song of Songs, alludes to Genesis and makes a mistake, and there's a riot in Paris over his mistake. The question of how to interpret the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. So there was literacy. How much of it I don't honestly know. That's a very good question. Again, I have seen when I did my studies in France. I've seen ancient like 800s French. I've seen 800s German, and it is neither French neither German nor French nor Latin. It's kind of in the middle. So I think you probably had a lot of local variations. How much they really varied, I don't know. Kind of funny. I saw a video yesterday about Old English and Old Scandinavian, and could they be mutually understood? And their theory was yes. Um, but so it may have been that it was just like heavy accents. It's like somebody from California going to Appalachia and listening and going like, "Wow, there's an accent." That may have been something like it. It's a very good question. I don't have that was a very very long answer to a short question. It really isn't an answer. I don't have a really good cohesive answer for you on that.
But you did give some insight. Thank you.
Any other questions about the seven or eight hundreds? All right. As things are mostly quiet, I'm going to let you gentlemen go early this evening. I will upload these videos for tomorrow. Believe me, the days are coming and soon are, as our Lord would say, when we will not be finishing this early. The darker part of the dark ages here is there are major trends, but there's not as much. We don't know as much, and not as much happened as far as on an individual level. So enjoy the evenings where we're off a little bit early. Um, but there are no other questions, have you guys all been able to access the videos, if you wanted to on the YouTube's channel? All right, very good. Again, I'm working on and will, as soon as I'm humanly possible, upload the slides in case you want to just click through the slides and look at them and remind yourself what we're talking about. And again, I will welcome questions. If you and again, as we get farther along, I welcome questions on any of this. Um, and I'll try to put together a summary of the different centuries and such. But in the meantime, enjoy. And I look forward to seeing all of you next Friday.
Thank you, Father. Good night.
Thank
All
you,
right. Good
Father.
night. Good night and God bless.
Mhm.